Hey, welcome. Today we're diving into something amazing, the living, breathing skin that wraps around every single one of your cells. We're talking about the cell membrane. And get this, it's not some static wall. It's a dynamic, bustling barrier that's always on the move.
So that brings us to this huge design challenge that every cell has to solve. How in the world do you build something that can keep all the important watery stuff in, but at the same time be flexible enough to move, communicate, and act as a gatekeeper for what comes in and out? Well, the answer is one of the most elegant and, frankly, beautiful solutions in all of biology, the fluid mosaic model.
All right, let's break down that name, because it's not just a fancy term, it's actually the perfect description. We're going to start with that first word, fluid, because it tells you something absolutely fundamental about how this whole thing works. So what does fluidity even mean here? Well, it's pretty simple, actually. It just means that all the little bits and pieces making up the membrane, the phospholipids, the proteins, all of it, they aren't locked in place. They're constantly shifting around, flowing past each other, almost like people mingling in a crowded room. And here's the real kicker. There are no strong chemical bonds holding these molecules side by side. Nope, they're just floating next to each other. And that very lack of rigid connections is what gives the membrane its incredible ability to flow, to bend, and to change its shape on a dime.
Okay, so that leads to a really obvious question, right? If all these molecules are just freely floating around without being chemically tied down, what stops the whole membrane from just dissolving into a soupy mess? What's holding it all together?
Well, the answer is genius in its simplicity. It's all about the environment. You see, the inside of the cell is mostly water, and the outside of the cell is mostly water. But the membrane itself, it's made of lipids, which are basically fats. So just think about a drop of oil in a glass of water. It holds its shape perfectly, right? Not because its molecules are bonded tight, but simply because oil and water just do not mix. That's the cell membrane. It's a self-assembling bubble of fat that traps the water inside. It doesn't need bonds.
All right, so we've got the fluid part down. Now let's tackle the second half of the name. Where does the word mosaic come into play?
The scientists who first came up with this model, Singer and Nicholson, they used this absolutely brilliant analogy to explain it. They pictured it as being like one of those old-school mosaic floors, with little marble chips scattered around in wet cement.
So in their analogy, that wet cement is the fluid, flowing sea of phospholipids that makes up the bulk of the membrane. And those marble chips? Well, those are all the different proteins that are studded and embedded within that phospholipid sea. They're scattered all throughout, creating this beautiful, ever-changing pattern, a mosaic.
Okay, so now that we understand this whole concept of a fluid mosaic, let's zoom in and properly meet the cast of characters. There are 5 main molecular components that really make this incredible structure what it is.
So we've got 5 key players on the team. First up, you have the phospholipids, which form that basic 2-layer fabric. Then there's cholesterol, which is kind of like the manager, making sure the fluidity is just right. Next, you have the proteins, the real workhorses. You've got intrinsic ones that go all the way through, and extrinsic ones that just hang out on the surface. And finally, you have the carbohydrates, which act like tiny ID tags for the cell.
Now, the absolute star of the show is the phospholipid. This molecule has a serious split personality. It's got a head that is hydrophilic. It absolutely loves water. But then it has these 2 long tails that are hydrophobic. They can't stand water. So when you toss them into the watery environment of the body, what do? They automatically arrange themselves into this perfect double layer, with all the water-loving heads facing out and all the water-fearing tails hiding on the inside. It creates that perfect barrier, all by itself.
Now, tucked right in between all those phospholipids, you'll find cholesterol. And you can think of cholesterol as the membrane's bouncer or thermostat. See, when things get cold, phospholipids like to huddle together and get stiff. Cholesterol wedges itself in between them, keeping things loose and fluid. And when it gets too hot and the phospholipids start getting a little too wild and fluid, cholesterol is there to hold them together and keep the membrane from falling apart. It's a brilliant little regulator.
Okay, so we've got this amazing fluid mosaic structure with all its key players, but let's see how it actually works in a real-life situation. Let's say your body needs to defend itself against an invader, like a nasty bacterium. Remember those carbohydrates we mentioned? This is their moment to shine. On the outside of the cell membrane, these little carb chains are attached to proteins and lipids, and they act like the cell's unique ID card. They let your body's other cells know, hey, I'm one of you, I'm self. But they also work as receptors that can spot a foreign invader, like a bacterium, which is going to have a totally different ID card on its surface.
And this right here is where the whole model just comes to life. So an immune cell recognizes a pathogen, and the bad guy binds to one of those receptors. Now, because the membrane is fluid, it can do something incredible. It literally starts to change shape, flexing and wrapping itself around the bacterium, totally engulfing it. Then, it pinches off on the inside, trapping the invader in a little bubble called a vesicle. That vesicle gets sent off to be destroyed by the cell's internal defenses. This whole process, called endocytosis, is only possible because the membrane is a dynamic, moving structure and not some stiff wall. It's amazing.
So after all of that, what's the big idea? What's the one thing you really need to take away from all of this?
It's this. The very edge of life isn't a rigid wall. It's a living, breathing boundary. The ability of all its little parts to move, to flow, and to interact with each other is what allows the cell to eat, to talk to its neighbors, and to defend itself. Its structure is its function. It's a living, adapting gateway.
And that kind of leaves us with this one last fascinating thought to chew on. We think of ourselves as having these fixed, solid boundaries. But what we've just seen is that at the tiniest, most fundamental level, the very edge of every one of your trillions of cells is this fluid, constantly shifting sea of molecules. So it really makes you wonder, where do you actually end, and where does the rest of the world begin? Thanks for joining us.